I'm David Olusoga. I'm Professor of Public History at the University of Manchester, and this is my lockdown lecture. I'm always interested to ask historians why they started studying history. The responses are often really varied, and they sometimes make me feel rather embarrassed because my journey to history was a bit of a cliche. I wanted to study history from an early age because it was the subject I cared about most at school. It was the only subject, the only one, in which I had an inspirational teacher. But if I'm honest, the first encounters I had with history were all about the Second World War. It was a boy's own interest in war, the result of too many war films, too many plastic guns and toy soldiers. It was only later that it became an academic passion, and only later that it became, to me, the key to understanding the story of me and my family and my background. The true passion for the broad sweep and the philosophy of history was something that came later as well. And the idea that I could be an historian was not something that crossed my mind until I was at university. People from the social economic background that I came from didn't aspire to be historians or academics. They didn't aspire to enter the professions. Now, my mother pushed her children to excel at school and university, and what happened was that the assumptions and the low expectations that I picked up not at home, but at school and from the wider society. And they convinced me, perhaps subconsciously, that for me, university, if I got there, would just be a 3-year suspension of reality. And that even with a degree, I didn't have any real chance of entering a middle-class profession, having a career rather than a job. It was only at university that I came to realize that doors that I presumed were closed to me might, if not be open, they might at least be openable. In this, I'm not in the least bit unusual. I was recently talking to a journalist who works on a major national newspaper who had a similar mental journey from presuming doors were closed and then raising the courage tentatively to try to push against them to see if they could be opened. Yet in my mid-20s, I made a radical decision. I decided I didn't want to do a PhD, which was becoming a real prospect very suddenly, and that instead, I wanted to go to journalism school to study how to make television and radio. And then I got a very junior job in the BBC. I still wanted to do history, but I wanted to do it through television. And the reason that I made this slightly odd decision was simple, because the one history teacher I'd had who'd inspired me had also inspired me, along with my mother, to start watching history documentaries on television. And there, on television, I encountered other inspirational teachers. And the most inspirational of all was Michael Wood, who I'm really honoured and slightly astonished to be able to now call a colleague at the University of Manchester. Doing history in television is very different from doing it in an academic setting. Even at university, I was incapable of focusing down on a single subject and narrowing my interests. And I went on to study a completely different area of history for my second degree that had no relationship to what I'd studied in my first degree. So I liked the fact that television doesn't allow you to specialize, even if you wanted to. Even the most in-depth, complicated, high-budget, landmark television history series will be made in around 1 year. Once it's over, you're onto a new project and a completely different subject. However, despite likening this broadening of my range that I got through television and the opening up of these areas of history that were new to me, there was one area that had been with me since I was 16. And it's apparent in many of my programs that I've made as both a producer and a presenter, and that's the history of the Black presence in Britain. But because I'd studied slavery and the empire as an undergraduate, and because my own family's journey was a journey from West Africa and the United Kingdom and the links between those two parts of the world, imperial connections, I always saw that history was global and that the story of the British presence in Britain was an imperial tale. A classic complaint among scholars who study British imperial history is that the imperial dimensions of innumerable aspects of our past, as well as our culture, our cuisine, our language, and our economy, have been quietly forgotten or conveniently brushed under the carpet. it's ironic that the same has to an extent and at times been true of the study of the Black presence in Britain. And what I wanted to do as an historian was to reconnect that story of migration and community formation with the broader imperial story. That's been a mission. It's the center of the work that I've done. It's the center of the work I'm doing right now in lockdown. However, while doing this work and enjoying doing it, I'm also aware that there is an inherent dilemma that faces anyone from a BAME background who studies race, slavery, and empire. It's the dilemma of being pigeonholed, of being corralled into only studying subjects and aspects of history that relate to race or the Black experience. The late Toni Morrison famously wrote the following: "The function, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Someone says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Someone says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdoms, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing." Within that brilliantly observed and brilliantly expressed statement is the heart of the dilemma. For as long as certain ethnic groups are said to have no art, or, as Hegel said of Africans, no history, for as long as the ideas born out of the pseudo-scientific racism of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries shape how people of colour are perceived and how they're treated, there is, I would go as far as saying, a duty among Black historians and scholars to do, as Morrison said, to dredge up from the past and from living cultures and communities the full richness and complexity of Black humanity. So I see it as my job and my public role as a public historian to, for example, when we commemorate the centenary of the First World War, to remind people of the role played by African soldiers and carriers, to remind people of the Indian army that was sent to the Western Front and then to Mesopotamia, of the Chinese laborers who dug the trenches of the Western Front, to the poor Jamaicans who literally stowed away on ships to get to London to try to join the British Army. I see it as my job when tens of thousands of our fellow citizens are stripped of their Britishness, losing jobs and savings and houses, to remind people of the 70 years of governmental hostility towards non-white migration that led to the Windrush scandal. Much of that hostility shockingly and easily accessible in documents at the National Archive, and yet ignored for the most part for many decades. However, the challenge that Morrison identified and the trap she warned us of is that there will always be more than one thing. If it's the role of Black historians and Black scholars more generally, then it can be an encompassing role. The time taken to do it precludes the options of other areas of study. It bars access to other avenues of investigation. The risk of being pigeonholed is the risk of how others perceive you. The far greater risk is the active and urgent role of being a Black historian, particularly a Black historian, in my view, in public history, is that it will overwhelm your other options. It will close off other avenues and other options. Now, I feel fortunate here because my strange meandering career through different mediums and constantly changing subjects, because I started my passion for history by reading endlessly about the Second World War, and because I only became interested in Black history as a teenager, and thanks to the work I've done in television, that I have been able to work in a huge range of subjects. By accident, I've created a hinterland for myself that allows me to see my role more broadly. I have been repeatedly through my career asked the question, are you an historian or are you a Black historian? And these days I've stopped being annoyed at the question and instead have come up with an annoying answer. I obviously see myself as both. When I make programs about houses in the North in which poor people from the 19th century lived, I think about my British ancestors. When I make programs about the history of Africa, I think of my African ancestors. I am dual national, and that is an archetypal British imperial identity. Thank you.